Thanks very much. I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land on whose land we meet today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present and future. I'm not going to go over the AW raids, Daniel's covered that, but what I want to talk about is that there is a crisis in this country around freedom of speech and around freedom of association, particularly for the union movement. I think we need to remember that the union movement still remains the largest organised, community-based organisation in this country. It is the largest organisation that is able to influence government and change government and represent working people. And while I hear the figures around where the union movement is at the moment, what we should remember is that the enterprise agreements and the awards that unions look after cover at least 60% of working people in this country. I think it's fair to say that over the last 10 years, 20 years, we've seen a significant curtailing of the rights of unions. This is not something that in the last 5 years the Conservatives got together and thought, oh, let's try and knock off the unions. This has been something that's been going on for the last 30 years. Whether it's the Melbourne Club and those sort of people who are getting together to work out how to curtail the rights of working people. And I think that curtailing of working people's rights and the overreach or the hubris of this government in relation to this has been borne out in the raids on the AWU. Think about some of the legislation that's currently before this Parliament. The Ensuring Integrity Bill that enables the government to deregister sections of unions or whole unions, to suspend officials who may have a speeding fine because they are not a fit and proper person. It is legislation that puts a higher burden of proof or a higher fit and proper person test on a union official than it does on people in the corporate boardrooms. That's why it hasn't passed so far, because the crossbenchers even recognise that this bill is overreach by this government. And let's think about the appointments recently over the last three years to the Fair Work Commission. The last 14 appointments have been of a conservative nature. Previously, you get one from the right, one from the left, one from the right, one from the left. This government is not abiding by the etiquette of how these appointments have been made. The last 14 appointments have been Conservative appointments. Now, what does that actually mean? I think that the decision that typifies the attack on workers in relation to this is the Horizon case. And that's a case, I don't know if many people know this, but it's a case where the Fair Work Commission ruled that in the public interest, an enterprise agreement could be cancelled or terminated because the two parties couldn't reach agreement. Remembering that the Fair Work Act does not provide for any arbitration provisions unless both parties agree. Now you might say, oh, well, you know, we've got to cancel an enterprise agreement, they must go into arbitration and fix it. No, that's not what happens. So the agreement was terminated and people were put on the modern award, the very basic of conditions. And how did that get through? Because the employer provided an undertaking to the Commission that no one would be worse off. And what happened then? The agreement was terminated, people went on to the modern award, and workers were then sacked. I don't see how in this country, under contract law, you can come to an agreement between two parties, have a binding contract, the court then has the right to terminate that contract, and one of the parties is worse off, significantly worse off than they were prior to the contract being signed. Even if those workers went back on the previous enterprise agreement, they'd be thousands and thousands of dollars better off than where they are. And in a political sense, we saw 3 or 4 years ago the state Liberal government pass electoral funding laws that prohibited unions putting their money together in order to campaign in elections. Unions have to register as third-party campaigners, subjected to the same rules of disclosure as the major parties. And what we argued is, workers have always had the right to bring their money together, to pool it in order to fight capital. And the High Court found in our favour. It found that this law stopped the right to have political expression in this country, and the legislation was scrapped and it was taken out. But again, another example of overreach by the Conservatives in attempting to silence working people. Another example that we've uncovered recently, and it goes to a broader concept of people who are here on visas working, particularly migrants. We estimate that there's about 1 in 10 people in this country who are working on some form of visa. That is 1 in 10 people who don't have a right to vote and influence the legislation under which they work. Many of these people are foreign students. Many of them are allowed to work 20 hours a week. But what do we find? We did a survey or researched a number of job ads in a number of community languages, and what we found was around 70% of people, 75% of people were working for less than the minimum pay, less than the minimum rate of pay in their industries. This is not right in this country. It should not be a case where if you have a job, your employer has the right to say, well, I'm not going to pay you correctly, and if you're going to say anything, I'm going to go to the Department of Immigration and have you deported. Now, the Fair Work Ombudsman in this country, and Dan touched on them as well, they put themselves out there as solving workers' problems, as an alternative to the union movement. They have a claim that any migrant worker who is a whistleblower for wage theft, will be looked after and won't be deported. Under a Freedom of Information investigation that we conducted, we found out that that promise is very, very shaky, at best. What that says to these people is, if you come to this country and you are ripped off, you have to shut up and take it. That's a terrible state of affairs in this country, a terrible state of affairs. Well, they're not using them as surplus labour. What's happening here is that unscrupulous employers are trying to bring in an underclass that has no rights legally, no democratic rights to participate in the system, and are exploiting them. This is a country of immigration, and we should not be afraid of immigration. We should not be afraid of immigration. What we should be afraid of is a country where we don't have the proper services in place to allow people to get an education. Why is it in this country that we are now destroying TAFE? Destroying TAFE. To allow people to actually move through the economic bands in society. You can't do it without an education. TAFE has always been the basis of allowing working class kids to get out and get on better. And then many of them go on to university, many of them go to run on big companies and do other jobs and that sort of stuff. The question has become in this country, how do we actually address this inequality? And the figure I use is that, and I've said in the last election, is that there are 6 people in this country who have the same combined wealth as the bottom 20% of all Australians. That is 6 people have the same combined wealth as 4.2 million Australians, and that inequality is getting worse. And it is because we are unable to have governments that are prepared to look at the redistribution of income. I mean, how can we have a 65 billion tax cut? A 65 billion tax cut in this country. I mean, at best, if you're going to have a $65 billion tax cut, you wouldn't give it to the corporate end of town, you give it to working people, because you know at least working people are going to spend that money in the economy and generate jobs. Yeah. That's where it should be going.
Now look at the economy going.
And these are the questions we actually have to start agitating about. And I know I get questions about the union movement and where's your power gone and all those sorts of things. The thing that we have to think about, and I say when I talk to working people, is that we think of the union as equals movement. But the union movement has to be bigger than just itself. The challenge for us is to grow, is to re-educate and talk to young people. One of the big determinants of whether you are or you aren't a union member is if there is someone in your house, in your household, who is actually a union member. But now we're going to a generation or a second generation where no one in their household has been a union member. But young people, the density, it's about 7% of young people under 25 join a union. But by God, when you actually talk to them and you explain to them what a union is and they participate in that, they go, I get what this is about. People have an innate sense of collectability. They want to be in a collective, they want to work together, and particularly if they're being ripped off. Many of the workers I talked about previously know they're being ripped off, but they haven't got the confidence to step forward and say something about it. That's the challenge for the union movement, to be relevant, to be innovative, to educate and work to change the society in which we have. Thanks very much.